Good morning. I recently had the privilege of taking a trip to the Middle East, and I spent about 10 days in Jordan with an archaeological trip. A friend of mine who is an archaeologist, other friends, and a few people from Lifeline went with me. We had a wonderful time. It was an amazing trip. You might wonder, why would we go to Jordan? Well, Jordan is east of the Jordan River. Of course, we're familiar with going to Israel for archaeological sites and so forth that attest to the biblical text. But there's actually quite a few, particularly Old Testament places, not exclusively Old Testament, but predominantly Old Testament, that are east of the Jordan. You got the land of the Moabites, the land of the Edomites, the land of the Ammonites. To the north, you have the area where Elijah came from in Tishbe. You also have the area that the Israelites wandered in. Much of their wanderings were in that area, actually. You might, in your mind, think of like Sinai as the place of their wandering, but you should actually think of them really spending a lot of time east and southeast of Israel, east of the Dead Sea, and so forth. And so I had the privilege on this trip of visiting a number of sites. Probably my favorite site in terms of a spiritual meaning for me is a site that is the center of one of my favorite texts in the Bible. And I had the privilege of being at this particular site. In fact, I'm going to conclude this video with a little video clip of just sitting up there and sort of just give you the serenity of the site. It's a desert site. You'll see a bunch of sheep and goats going around. And I literally was sitting just meditating on the Lord and praying for a bit in this particular location, surrounded by sheep and goats. It was serene and surreal. The site is Peniel. Peniel. It means the face of God. And it's the location of what takes place in Genesis 32, where Jacob wrestles with God at a very vulnerable time in his own life, where he is anticipating meeting Esau, who he's going to meet Esau, who he has wronged, and who he is anticipating is coming for maybe revenge. It actually isn't the case. Esau doesn't come for revenge. But Jacob, who has a history of lying, who has a history of deception, and who has a history of trying to fight his way to the top, so to speak, meets God. And some things happen there that are pretty significant and pretty meaningful. I want to read the text to you. It's Genesis 32, and just highlight a couple of things. Genesis 32, verse 22 through 32. The same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. And he took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. And Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. And then he said, "Let me go, for the day is broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Isn't that interesting? Jacob seems to suspect that there's something about this man that might be unique. And so he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." It means heel grabber, person who trips people up, right? The one who is out for the other, the one that causes people in front of him to stumble. Jacob. Then he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel." And I say it that way because we'll say Israel, but Israel, and I want to emphasize the L. It's what's called a theophoric element. It's a reference to God, God. For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Now, scholars have a little bit of debate here. Does it mean striving with God, or does it mean the one whom God strives for? Could be either. The tumultuous relationship of the nation of Israel with God throughout Israel's history is certainly, this text is like prophetic of. And yet that striving sort of happens both ways, meaning that they're resistant to God on the one side, and yet God is always in pursuit, always striving for them. It's a striving dynamic that exists between them. You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for he's striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Verse 29, then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But this man who wrestles with him says, why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, for I've seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh. I want to highlight a couple of things for you. There's certainly something to be said about identification in an encounter with God that happens here. There's something we glean from that. And that is that sometimes in moments where we feel threatened or vulnerable, sometimes God brings us into those moments, like he brought Jacob into that moment where he isolates Jacob on Peniel. And he has him in a spot where he's facing something daunting, and it's there that God, right, as a man, but this is clearly a divine presence, comes and wrestles with him. It's in that context that the presence of God wrestles, whether it's an angel representing God or whether it's a theophany of some kind, but this divine presence wrestles with God, wrestles with Jacob rather, and in wrestling with Jacob, he renames him. He gives him a new identity. You were this heel grabber, you were this deceiver, you were this person who trips people up, but now something's going to be different. Now God is after you. You're Israel. There's identity that comes in an encounter with God if you are available, even in some of your most daunting circumstances. There's also, though, in the midst of an encounter with God, as you face daunting circumstances, a kind of mystery that sits. Years ago, I was going through some difficulty. This was in the early days of planting Lifeline. And a wonderful man that I was a great encouragement to me when I first moved to Utah, almost 20 years, about 19 and a half years ago. His name was Roger. And Roger had worked with Young Life for a lot of years here. Roger came down, met me in my office at the time. And I was sharing with Roger some of my tensions and some of my frustrations in planting the church. And I'll never forget, Roger looked at me across my desk in a very moving moment in my office, and he held out his hands. And he said, Bryan, I want to ask you a question. And I said, what's that, Roger? And he said, can you live in a way where you hold mystery in your hands? Can you hold it there? I've thought a lot about that in my life. I've thought about a lot of that a lot in circumstances subsequent to Roger saying that. About like when life happens and difficulty comes, are you okay? Am I okay? Not knowing the answer and just sitting with mystery. The reason why I ask that in regard to this text is the statement, and there he blessed him. Where is there? There is on the top of Peniel. There is the place where God discloses himself to Jacob. There is where he wrestles There is the place where he is wounded. There is an encounter that defines the rest of his life. There is a place he never leaves the same. There is a location where he's renamed. There is a place of mystery that marks him and wounds him. As you sit in the circumstances of your life, there, can you hold mystery in your hands, or do you want to run off the anvil? Can you hold mystery in your hands, or do you want to run down the hill? Can you hold mystery in your hands, or do you just resent the one who wrestles with you? Jacob is identified. He embraces mystery. And then it turns to wonder, right? He says, I'm going to name this place Peniel, the face of God, saying, for I've seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. So Jacob says, okay, I've wrestled here. I've wrestled with the divine presence. I've wrestled with God. And in wrestling with God, seeing and encountering him, now I'm turned to a place where I say, thank you, Lord, for this place. Thank you for this space. And then in this like poetic vision, the sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. And you get this, okay, he's marked. He's marked because he was willing to be identified, hold mystery in his hands, and embrace the wonder of a moment, an encounter. Whatever you're going through in your life, I just want you to be able to see the hand of God in it, to be able to hold mystery in your hands, to be able to not have everything explained, to be able to maybe say, okay, perhaps in this, God is trying to do something with me in whatever I'm going with. And ask, quest, be willing to wrestle, be willing to sit, be willing to seek. Check out, as we close, and maybe you just meditate, it's only about 45 seconds long or so, just this closing little video of Peniel and what the setting was like up there. May the Lord bless you.